Claire Pearson had never planned to move to a place like Silver Creek. She wasn't looking for charm, or curb appeal, or any sense of manufactured community. After 30 years of working in corporate logistics, managing impossible schedules, overseeing teams of unreliable subordinates, and weathering boardroom power plays that always left her with a polite smile and a clenched jaw, she craved one thing: only autonomy. When the divorce papers were finalized and the silence of her empty townhouse in Denver became too loud, she took the settlement money and drove west with no plan other than to buy something that was hers and only hers. The house she chose in Silver Creek wasn't impressive, but it had a backyard, and for Claire that meant potential. Not for parties or family barbecues, she had no one left to invite, but for a garden, a real one, something chaotic and alive that didn't obey imposed systems. The first thing she did, even before unpacking, was tear up the useless sod that came with the house. Within a month, the rectangular patch of green was replaced with winding lines of earth, small mounds bordered by uneven stone, and clusters of plants that didn't match but didn't need to. She planted bee balm, coneflowers, creeping thyme, columbine, and fragrant herbs like lavender and rosemary. Each corner of the garden had a purpose: color, texture, scent. She built a small rock bench near the patch of foxglove and started her mornings there, wrapped in a sweater, watching the mist rise off the petals. It wasn't an expensive renovation. It was a personal one. It had nothing to do with the neighborhood and everything to do with reclaiming space in a world that had always asked her to tone herself down. Here, she could be as vibrant, overgrown, and uneven as she liked. At first, she assumed the glances were just curiosity. Silver Creek was the kind of place where people still waved when they passed your driveway, even if you'd never spoken. Her nearest neighbors, Gerald and Denise, were a retired couple who always walked their dog past her house at precisely 7:30 a.m. Claire nodded politely, occasionally accepted a compliment about her roses, but never engaged beyond that. It suited her, until the day she received a typed letter on heavy paper, left not in the mailbox but wedged between the slats of her front door. The header read, "Silver Creek Neighborhood Committee," in a font that tried very hard to seem friendly. The message, however, was anything but. "Dear resident," it began, "we would like to remind all members of our community that landscape consistency is essential to maintaining the visual harmony of Silver Creek. Recently, concerns have been raised about non-standard flora and layout alterations on your property that fall outside the committee's recommended guidelines. Please review the attached compliance packet and submit your proposed changes within the next 30 days to avoid citation." Claire didn't finish the rest. She folded the paper carefully, placed it in the drawer by the fridge where she kept rubber bands and expired coupons, and decided to ignore it. There was no mention of a legal infraction, no demand with teeth, just suggestion wrapped in etiquette. She assumed that would be the end of it. But over the next week, she noticed new things. A neighbor who used to wave stopped doing so. A pair of strangers lingered too long outside her fence, speaking in low voices and jotting notes on a clipboard. The next letter came 5 days later, this one hand-delivered by a woman named Catherine Jones, the president of the neighborhood committee. Claire met her on the porch, arms crossed and polite smile firmly in place. Catherine was tall, silver-haired, and wore a beige cardigan over a blouse that looked starched within an inch of its life. Her tone was soft, pleasant, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent in her words. "It's lovely that you've taken such an interest in gardening," she said. "We do, of course, encourage creativity, within reason, but some of the members have expressed concern about the eclectic nature of your choices. We strive for cohesion here in Silver Creek. It's what keeps property values strong." Claire's answer was simple and firm. "I'm not changing anything. The plants are healthy. The garden's on my land. That's all that matters." Catherine's smile didn't falter, but her eyes did something Claire had seen too many times in boardrooms, tightened, cold, and calculating. "Of course, just thought I'd check in personally." She left without another word. Claire watched her walk down the path and disappear behind the hedges. That night, something about the silence around her house felt heavier. Not ominous exactly, but dense. Something had shifted. And for the first time since moving in, Claire realized that her fight for peace and autonomy might not be as quiet as she had hoped. The first real sign that something was wrong came not from a letter, not from a neighbor's glare or a petty complaint, but from the plants themselves. Claire had always believed that a garden could speak, not in words or human logic, but through patterns. How it grew, how it wilted, how it resisted or thrived. She noticed it on a Monday morning, stepping outside with her usual cup of chamomile tea and a well-worn notebook she used to track plant growth. The lavender on the south bed, which had been in full fragrant bloom the week prior, looked washed out, almost sun-bleached, though the weather had been mostly overcast. The sage leaves were curled inward like fists, and a patch of sweet alyssum had developed strange orange spots that weren't part of any disease Claire could recognize. She knelt down, ran a gloved hand over the soil and found it dry near the surface but oddly damp and clumped underneath. Something felt off, not just in the texture of the soil, but in the air around the garden. The usual early buzz of bees was missing, and there was a faint bitter odor she couldn't place. She told herself it was probably just a shift in weather patterns or a nutrient imbalance and decided to give it a few days. But each morning brought new signs. The thyme browned at the tips. The milkweed shriveled without any sign of pest activity. Even the hardy yarrow she'd grown from seed began to sag under its own weight. Plants that had thrived for weeks in perfect balance were failing, selectively, curiously. It wasn't uniform. Some sections remained vibrant, untouched, while others looked as if they had been systematically weakened. Claire, not one to panic over problems she couldn't explain, still felt her pulse tighten in her neck as the pattern began to emerge. This wasn't overwatering, underwatering, too much sun, or poor drainage. This was interference, subtle, targeted, and calculated. 3 days later, Claire bought a sealed sampling kit from a garden supply store in town and collected soil from the affected areas. She labeled each bag, packed them with notes, and drove an hour out to a private lab that handled agricultural analysis. She didn't mention the community, or the neighbor visits, or Catherine Jones. She simply told the technician that something was killing her garden, and she wanted to rule out contamination. The man behind the desk didn't ask many questions. He told her results could take up to 5 business days, and she left feeling unsettled by how clinical it all felt. By the time she pulled back into Silver Creek, the unease had become harder to ignore. Her eyes caught on every hedge that looked just a little too trimmed, every neighbor's house with its perfect white window frames and identical mulch rings around the trees. It was as if she were returning to a stage set up for a play she hadn't agreed to be part of. 2 days before the lab results came back, Claire received an envelope that hadn't been sent through the mail. It had no postage, no return address, just her name written neatly in blue ink. Inside was a single page, typed again on thick stationery. "This is a friendly reminder," it began, "that failure to adhere to previously communicated guidelines regarding landscape design may result in formal citation. Further inspection of your property will be scheduled within the week. Non-compliance is subject to escalating fines." Claire held the paper in her hand for a long time before setting it down and staring out the window toward her garden. There was no reference to a specific violation, no date, no signature. Just a threat wrapped in passive tone, left like a warning on her doorstep. Later that night, Claire decided to do something she hadn't done since moving in: walk the perimeter of her yard after dark. She wasn't looking for answers. She didn't expect to catch someone in the act. She simply felt compelled to see the place under different light, to feel the edges of what was hers when the rest of the world wasn't watching. The moon was bright, casting long shadows over the garden beds. The lavender looked ghostly silver, the thyme pale and delicate. As she passed the western corner of her fence, she noticed a patch of crushed grass near the side gate, the kind of impression left by someone standing still for too long. She knelt down and touched the blades. They were damp, bent flat, and still smelled faintly of synthetic rubber, like the soles of new shoes. There were no footprints, nothing concrete, but Claire had the distinct feeling that someone had been standing there, just beyond view, watching. The next morning, the lab called. The technician's tone was direct, not alarming but clipped, as if this were a result he'd delivered many times before. Ms. Pearson, the soil samples you submitted contain detectable traces of clopyralid, an herbicide used primarily in commercial weed control. It's not a common choice for residential use because of its persistence and the risk it poses to non-target plants, particularly ornamentals. It's also regulated in many states, restricted for sale to licensed applicators. It's the sort of thing you'd find in large-scale landscaping or municipal grounds maintenance, not from any consumer-grade product. Claire asked if it could have leached from somewhere else, maybe from water runoff or residue in the compost she bought. The technician was careful with his words. Possible, but unlikely. The concentrations are patchy, not consistent across all samples. It appears to have been applied selectively, not as a widespread environmental exposure. I'd suggest being cautious. Claire thanked him and hung up, sitting at the kitchen table in silence. She stared down at the notes she had taken during the call. Selective, she read aloud, the word sitting heavy in the air. Her first instinct was to report it to someone, to the local government, maybe the Environmental Health Department, but then she hesitated. Report what, exactly? She had evidence of chemical contamination, but no footage, no witness, no record of who might have had the motive or access. She had no concrete idea who had stepped into her yard, no way to connect any person to any specific action, and yet, in her gut, she knew it was deliberate. It wasn't the kind of vandalism that left a broken window or a crude message. It was the kind of damage that crept in quietly, surgically, executed with enough knowledge to do harm without leaving fingerprints. Claire didn't believe in paranoia for its own sake, but she did believe in pattern recognition, and the pattern was undeniable. The next day, she visited the local garden center to speak with the manager, a sharp, middle-aged woman named Ruth who had run the place for nearly 20 years. Claire casually asked if anyone had recently purchased commercial-grade herbicides, or asked about strong weed suppressants. Ruth gave her a strange look and told her no one could buy that kind of product there without certification. It was against state law. Claire nodded, thanked her, and left. Outside, as she loaded her car, she noticed a familiar vehicle across the parking lot. A black SUV she had seen parked along her street on more than one occasion, often idling near the bend. It drove off before she could get a good look at the driver. By that evening, Claire found herself standing at the edge of her garden once again, but this time she didn't feel like it belonged to her. The earth was still hers, the stones and flowers still bore her arrangement, but the space had been violated, not in a dramatic way, not with a break-in or a scream, but through something colder, quieter, and infinitely more invasive. Her sanctuary had been poisoned, literally and symbolically, and the worst part was knowing that whoever had done it believed she wouldn't, or couldn't, fight back. That night, for the first time since moving to Silver Creek, she slept with the porch lights on and her bedroom window closed. Claire wasn't a stranger to pressure. She had spent years in high-stakes environments where entire operations hinged on her ability to absorb stress, interpret unspoken agendas, and navigate volatile personalities. But this was different. This wasn't about work deadlines or boardroom tactics. This was personal. Her garden wasn't just a hobby. It was a quiet act of reclamation. And now it had become a battleground, one that didn't announce itself with explosions but rather with a slow and strategic corrosion. The strange chemical sabotage, the anonymous letters, and the unsettling presence of watchers who vanished as quickly as they appeared all pointed toward something coordinated, something that wasn't going to stop just because she knew it was happening. The day after receiving the lab results, Claire made an appointment with the county's Department of Environmental Protection. She drove downtown, checked in with the front desk, and met with a junior officer who specialized in residential contamination. She presented the lab reports, photographs of the garden, and a typed timeline of events. The officer, a young man who looked barely out of college, furrowed his brow as he flipped through the documents. "You're saying someone is intentionally applying restricted-use herbicides to your private garden?" he asked, not with disbelief, but with the kind of caution bureaucrats use when they know a situation is about to get messy. Claire nodded once and said plainly, "That's what the data says. The question is who and why." The man told her he would open an official case file and dispatch an investigator to collect independent soil samples. Claire left the building with a small surge of relief. It wasn't justice yet, but it was procedure, and procedure meant a paper trail. Someone, somewhere, would have to answer for what had been done, but the calm didn't last. That evening, a certified envelope was waiting at her door. Inside was a formal notice of inspection from the Silver Creek Neighborhood Committee. The letter referenced a series of resident-submitted concerns about her yard, citing issues like unsightly plant density, atypical growth patterns, and failure to maintain uniformity with adjacent lots. At the bottom, it stated that a visual inspection would occur within 72 hours and that refusal to comply could result in fines, administrative action, and further escalation. The timing couldn't have been more deliberate. Less than 24 hours after going to the county, the committee was now retaliating with an inspection of their own, using aesthetics as their weapon. It wasn't about flowers or grass. It was about control. Claire didn't respond. She spent the next 2 days documenting everything. She took detailed photographs of every plant, recorded dates and conditions, and even traced the irrigation paths in case anyone tried to claim runoff damage. On the morning of the inspection, she sat on her porch with a mug of black coffee and watched as 2 members of the committee approached her property. One was Catherine Jones, dressed in her signature beige blazer and holding a clipboard. The other was a man Claire didn't recognize, tall, expressionless, with the posture of someone who had been told to appear authoritative without actually understanding what that meant. They didn't knock. They walked the perimeter of her front yard, murmured to each other, scribbled notes, and pointed at plants like museum curators judging an abstract exhibit. Claire didn't interrupt. She simply watched, her gaze steady, her jaw tight. When they were done, Catherine finally turned and offered a practiced smile. "We'll be in touch," she said, as if this were a mere formality and not an escalation. That night, Claire's email lit up with another message from the committee. The subject line read, "Non-Compliance Notice." The body of the message contained a list of required modifications, including the removal of unauthorized plant groupings, trimming of hedges that obscure architectural sightlines, and the installation of ground cover consistent with neighborhood landscaping themes. A deadline was included, 10 days. No appeal was offered. No explanation of how these standards were created or enforced. Just a directive, cold and absolute. Claire stared at the screen in disbelief. The language was absurd, borderline dystopian. She could feel her pulse in her temples as the implications set in. They weren't just harassing her now. They were laying the groundwork to force compliance by policy, knowing full well she wouldn't bend. The following morning, she made an appointment with a property attorney, a seasoned woman named Valerie Ross who specialized in land use and community code disputes. Claire arrived at her office with a binder of documents and explained everything. Valerie listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes, her expression unreadable. When Claire finished, Valerie leaned back in her chair and sighed. "This isn't new," she said. "These committees have too much unchecked power. They wrap everything in language about property values and neighborhood standards, but it's really about control. And from what you've shown me, it's obvious they're using aesthetic codes as a smokescreen. The herbicide? That's serious. If we can connect it to someone on the committee, we have grounds for civil and potentially criminal charges. But proving that direct link is the hard part. They're being careful." Claire nodded. "So what do we do?" Valerie looked at her squarely. "We get ahead of them. You file a formal dispute. You document everything, every interaction. And if they issue fines, we don't pay. We contest. And if they step 1 inch over your property line, we escalate to the county. Let's give them paperwork to drown in." That evening, Claire returned home with a small measure of hope. The storm hadn't passed, but she had counsel, strategy, and a path forward. But just as she was unlocking her front door, she saw it. A small laminated notice stapled to her garden gate. It wasn't from the committee. It didn't bear a seal or official font. It was typed in plain black text, cut with a utility blade into perfect edges. "You should have just followed the rules," it read. No signature, no name, just the message, staring at her like a threat left in the open. Claire stood there for several minutes, staring at the paper, feeling the cold metal of the staple through her gloves. This was no longer about aesthetics. It wasn't about the plants or the neighborhood's artificial standards. It was about dominance. Someone, maybe several someones, had decided that Claire represented a problem. Not because of her garden, but because she refused to submit. The committee wasn't just enforcing guidelines. They were punishing defiance. And whoever had left the message wasn't afraid of being caught. They believed they were untouchable. But Claire had no intention of giving them what they wanted. Not now. Not ever. That night, she called Valerie and told her about the note. Valerie responded quickly and decisively. "Photograph it. Don't touch it further. I'll have someone come by to collect it. If they're smart, they left no prints. But if they're arrogant, they may have slipped." Claire did as instructed, and early the next morning, a private investigator contracted through Valerie arrived to take evidence. He was quiet, professional, and efficient, less interested in making conversation and more focused on gathering data. After he left, Claire sat on her porch and watched the garden sway in the breeze. Some of the new sprouts were already recovering. Life, as always, found a way to push forward, even under pressure. But Claire knew better than to confuse resilience with safety. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Claire woke up to a morning that felt colder than it should have. The thermostat read the same as usual. The weather outside was mild for that time of year, but something about the atmosphere carried a weight, an unspoken tension that settled in her chest like fog. She made her tea in silence, her routine unchanged, but her mind was restless. The garden, her place of peace, no longer greeted her with the same quiet joy. Instead, it drew her attention in a new way, like a patient exhibiting symptoms no one could diagnose. From the window, it looked calm, but she no longer trusted appearances. The message stapled to her gate had left a scar on her confidence. For weeks, she had held on to a sliver of optimism that perhaps this was all just a misunderstanding, the product of misplaced authority or overzealous enforcement. But now, she saw it clearly for what it was, a campaign, deliberate and sustained. And if someone was willing to poison her plants and leave thinly veiled threats, they weren't going to stop because she hired a lawyer. Later that afternoon, Valerie Ross called with an update. The private investigator had finished a preliminary sweep of Claire's property and the anonymous note. As predicted, there were no fingerprints on the laminated paper. Whoever left it had worn gloves. However, a shoe print was recovered from the mulch near the gate. It wasn't clear enough for immediate identification, but it was something. a trace of presence that meant the intruder had stepped into her space physically, not just metaphorically. Valerie's voice remained composed, but there was an edge of concern beneath her usual steadiness. "They're escalating," she said plainly. "Whoever is doing this, they're getting bolder. We need to do the same." Valerie recommended Claire install perimeter cameras. Not flashy ones, but discrete motion-triggered devices that could record without obvious visibility. She connected Claire with a trusted local technician who came by the next day and handled the job with quiet efficiency. Claire didn't want to turn her house into a fortress, but the illusion of privacy had already been shattered. Now she wanted clarity, proof, faces, a record. She wouldn't catch anyone in the act with emotion alone. She needed eyes in the dark. While the cameras were being installed, Claire received an unexpected phone call from someone she hadn't heard from since her first few days in Silver Creek. Denise, the neighbor with the golden retriever, had always seemed pleasant but distant. Now, her voice on the phone was hushed, uneasy. "Claire," she said, "I don't want to get involved, but I think you should know something." What followed was a story that made Claire go still. According to Denise, years ago, another resident, a woman named Teresa Weller, had tried something similar to Claire. She had redesigned her yard in an unconventional style, favoring native plants and wildflowers that didn't align with the manicured aesthetic pushed by the committee. After months of pressure, Teresa's yard was vandalized, plants uprooted, fencing destroyed, soil contaminated. She reported it, tried to push back, even involved the county. But within a year, she sold the house and left. Nothing ever came of the reports. The committee insisted it was neighborhood kids, an isolated incident. But the timing, Denise said, had always felt intentional. "I think what's happening to you isn't new, just better hidden." Claire thanked her, stunned into silence. After the call ended, she sat at her desk and opened the county property records. It didn't take long to find the old listing. Teresa had sold the house at a loss. The buyer? A shell company linked to a real estate broker who, upon deeper digging, turned out to be Catherine Jones's nephew. The connection wasn't illegal. It wasn't even unusual. But when viewed in the context of everything else, it painted a chilling picture. Valerie reviewed the findings and advised caution. "We still don't have a smoking gun," she said, "but we're building a pattern. This isn't just about you. It's structural." That word lingered in Claire's head. Structural. Not random, not petty, organized, institutionalized. That night, the cameras captured motion. At 2:17 a.m., a figure in dark clothing crept alongside the hedge and knelt by the rosemary patch. The footage wasn't clear enough to make out a face, but the posture, the build, the movement. It was all deliberate. The person wore gloves, moved with purpose, and was gone in under 3 minutes. Claire sent the footage to Valerie, who passed it to the investigator and filed it with the county along with a fresh report. There were now multiple incidents logged, and though no one had yet been named officially, the web was tightening. But with every step forward came another pushback. 2 days later, Claire received a new violation notice, this time for unauthorized structural modifications to her garden beds. They referenced the stone borders she'd laid months ago, borders that hadn't changed and had never been cited before. It was clear now that the committee was combing her property, looking for anything to weaponize. Valerie filed an injunction to freeze any action against Claire until the county investigation concluded. It bought time, but not peace. Meanwhile, Claire decided to pursue the paper trail herself. Not the criminal kind, that was in Valerie's hands, but the financial one. She began reviewing committee expenditures, which were public under Silver Creek's bylaws. It was tedious, but within 2 days she found something strange. A recurring payment listed under Maintenance Services went to a small landscaping company, Greenview Designs. On the surface, it seemed routine, But further searches revealed that the company shared an address with a logistics firm Catherine had once listed as a former employer in a community newsletter. The paper trail was murky, but suggestive. Valerie confirmed this wasn't nothing. "It's not illegal to have connections," she said. "But if those connections overlap with committee decision-making and enforcement actions, it raises serious ethical questions." The final break came unexpectedly. The investigator, now fully involved, managed to obtain a delivery record through a quiet source. A recent order of the very herbicide found in Claire's soil had been delivered to a storage unit registered under the same landscaping company. On the form, a signature that, while partially illegible, bore the initials KJ. Claire's breath caught when she saw the copy. It wasn't conclusive, not yet, but it was enough. Valerie filed a formal complaint with the county and requested immediate review by the Environmental Crimes Division. A hearing was scheduled. The committee was notified. Catherine, for the first time, went silent. The day before the hearing, Claire found her garden gate ajar. Not broken, not vandalized, just slightly open as if someone wanted her to see it, wanted her to feel the thinness of her defenses. She closed it, locked it, and sat on the porch long after sunset, her eyes fixed on the garden that had become so much more than dirt and blossoms. It was a symbol now, not of resistance for the sake of resistance, but of a simple truth. What's yours should not be violated, not because someone finds it non-standard, not because they think they can. That night, the lights in Claire's house stayed on well past midnight, not out of fear, but out of refusal. Let them see, she thought. Let them know she wasn't moving, not 1 inch. The morning of the county hearing arrived with a thick gray sky hanging low over Silver Creek, a muted kind of tension in the air that matched Claire's mood perfectly. She dressed with precision, not vanity. Charcoal slacks, a pale green blouse, a navy blazer. Nothing about her appearance was confrontational, but everything about it was intentional. She was done being passive. Valerie picked her up just after 9, and the ride downtown passed mostly in silence, punctuated only by the soft clicking of Valerie's pen against her clipboard and the faint rumble of tires on wet asphalt. Claire stared out the window as they drove past familiar streets, wondering how many of her neighbors had heard about the hearing, how many would be watching from behind blinds, waiting for news, and how many already knew which side they were on. Inside the hearing room, the setup was modest. Rows of chairs, a table for each party, and a panel of 3 county officials seated behind an elevated desk. It wasn't a courtroom, but the atmosphere carried the same formal weight. The hearing was administrative in nature, focused on the environmental complaint Claire had filed and the supporting evidence submitted by her attorney and the private investigator. The committee had been invited to present their position, but only one person showed up: Catherine Jones. She entered with the same poise and composure Claire remembered from their first encounter, dressed in a pale suit and clutching a leather folio like it was a weapon. But her eyes, sharp, calculating, unblinking, carried something new now: wariness. She had underestimated Claire once. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Valerie did most of the talking. She laid out the sequence of events with clinical precision: the pattern of plant deaths, the chemical analysis, the motion-activated footage, the anonymous threat, the financial entanglements with the landscaping company, the delivery records tied to restricted herbicides. The panel listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions but giving no indication of their opinions. Catherine remained still throughout, offering no rebuttal, no acknowledgement, simply watching with that same unreadable expression. When it was her turn to speak, she stood slowly and delivered a speech that might have sounded reasonable to someone unfamiliar with the situation. An impassioned defense of neighborhood standards, community cohesion, and her long record of volunteer leadership. She dismissed the herbicide evidence as speculative, the signature as a mistake, and the complaint as a personal vendetta rooted in misunderstanding. She was careful, polished, and practiced. Claire could almost admire the performance if it hadn't been so calculated. The panel did not deliver a decision that day. They promised a formal review and written response within 10 business days. Claire left the hearing room with a dull ache in her chest. It wasn't disappointment. It was exhaustion. She had told the truth, supported it with facts, stood her ground. Now she had to wait. But Silver Creek didn't wait. That same evening, she received a letter informing her of a special meeting scheduled by the neighborhood committee. The topic: community standards enforcement. The subtext was obvious. Catherine was fighting back. The meeting took place 2 days later in the community center, a neutral building that had hosted everything from yoga classes to holiday craft fairs. But that night the energy was different, thick with tension and whispered speculation. Claire arrived early, took a seat near the front, and watched as the room slowly filled with familiar faces. Some she recognized as allies, people who had quietly expressed support, who had waved or smiled in recent weeks with more warmth than obligation. Others avoided her gaze, clustered near the back, murmuring amongst themselves. When Catherine entered, the room quieted. She took her place at the head of the table and began to speak. What followed was a carefully worded monologue about the importance of unity, the risks of individualistic expression in shared spaces, and the committee's unfortunate burden of preserving order. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew who she meant. Claire listened, her face impassive, her hands still. Then something unexpected happened. Gerald, the older man from 2 doors down, always seen in his garage working on that same classic car, stood up. His voice was rough with age, but clear. "I've lived here 27 years, he said, "and I've never once had a problem with someone planting flowers. I've got no interest in uniformity if it means people get harassed in their own homes." A murmur spread through the room. Catherine's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. A second neighbor spoke next, Lisa, the young mother with 2 toddlers and a chaotic front lawn. "I got a letter about my yard last year. Said my garden gnomes were visually disruptive." That didn't feel like unity. That felt like control. Claire didn't speak. She didn't have to. The room was speaking for her now. The tide wasn't turning. It was shifting, slowly, cautiously, like people waking from a long sleep and realizing they had agreed to something they never truly understood. Catherine held her composure, thanked everyone for their feedback, and ended the meeting without incident. But her silence as she left the room was louder than any speech. Claire didn't celebrate. She knew better. Power didn't surrender overnight. The next morning, Claire found the rosemary bush completely uprooted. Not vandalized randomly, surgically removed, cleanly cut at the base, the soil smoothed over as if to hide the absence. No note this time. No cameras caught it. Whoever did it had timed it perfectly between recordings. It was a message. "We're still here." Claire documented the damage, filed another report, and doubled the camera coverage. Valerie reached out to the county again, pressing for an expedited decision. "They're getting sloppy," she said. "That's good for us. But you need to be careful." 2 nights later, Claire was woken by a sound she couldn't immediately place. Soft, metallic, distant. She got up, wrapped herself in a robe, and looked out through the living room window. Nothing. Then she heard it again, closer this time. She moved to the back door, opened it quietly, and stepped outside. The night was cool, the garden still. And then she saw it, a shadow moving along the far fence line. Not fast, not frantic, calm, like they belonged there. Claire didn't call out. She didn't move. She simply watched as the figure paused near the sage bush, crouched, and placed something in the soil. When the figure stood and turned toward the gate, the porch light caught just enough of a profile. It wasn't Catherine. It was the tall man from the first inspection, the one who had walked her yard with clipboard in hand and blank eyes. Claire didn't recognize him beyond that, but now she had a face, and that changed everything. She went inside, called Valerie, and left a message. The next day, she gave the camera technician a new instruction: expand coverage again, this time including infrared. Later that afternoon, a delivery arrived at her doorstep. A small brown box, no return address. Inside was a single item: a broken piece of garden statuary she had removed months ago, something only someone who had been in her backyard would have known existed. Tucked beside it was a folded piece of paper with a single line typed in the center: "You won't win." Claire read it once, then again, and then burned it in her fireplace. She didn't sleep that night, but not from fear, from clarity. The game had changed, and so would her response. The decision came on a Monday, just past noon. Claire had been outside, replanting the disturbed sagebush with careful hands, when her phone buzzed with the notification. A message from Valerie, succinct and direct. "We got it. Full decision in your favor. Call me." Claire stood in silence for several seconds, letting the weight of those words settle over her like a slow, deliberate exhale. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. What she felt was something quieter: affirmation, not victory. She had endured the slow poison of intimidation, the bureaucratic strangulation disguised as procedure, and the physical violation of her home. And now, finally, someone in power had said, "Enough." The county's findings were thorough. They confirmed deliberate contamination of Claire's property with restricted-use herbicide, identified discrepancies in the landscaping company's operations, and formally reprimanded the neighborhood committee for procedural overreach and abuse of authority. Catherine Jones was named directly in the report, not as a criminal suspect but as a central figure whose actions had violated the ethical boundaries of her position. The report recommended her immediate suspension from committee duties and referred the matter to the district attorney's office for further review. It wasn't an arrest warrant, but it was a beginning. A crack in the wall. Valerie arranged a formal delivery of the findings to the neighborhood committee. Claire didn't attend the meeting, but she knew exactly what was said. Witnesses later described the moment when Catherine received the letter. Her face, always composed and smug, went pale. She reportedly said nothing, simply gathered her belongings and left. By the next morning, an official notice was circulated throughout Silver Creek. Catherine Jones had resigned from her position on the committee, citing personal reasons. No acknowledgement, no apology, no admission of guilt. Just a quiet exit, the kind that people like her believed would preserve dignity. But the damage had already been done, and everyone in the neighborhood knew it. In the days that followed, the silence around Claire's home transformed. Where before there had been cold stares and distant avoidance, now there were quiet nods, short greetings, even offers of help. Gerald stopped by with fresh mulch. Lisa, from 3 houses down, asked Claire to help her plan a low-maintenance garden. Denise sent over a basket of lemon muffins with a note that read simply, "Thank you for not backing down." Claire accepted all of it with grace but kept her expectations measured. She hadn't fought this battle to win favor. She had done it to stop a rot that ran deeper than hedges and bylaws. What she had uncovered wasn't just about her garden. It was about how power can twist the ordinary into a weapon, and how easy it is for people to accept it when it doesn't touch them directly. But not everyone moved on so easily. 2 nights after Catherine's resignation, Claire was awoken by a noise near her fence. She turned on the porch light and stepped outside, but whoever had been there was already gone. In the morning, she found a small plastic bottle left near the gate, empty, labeled with the same herbicide she had battled for weeks. No note this time. Just a reminder, a last gasp of control from someone who no longer held any. Claire handed it over to the investigator, who logged it and passed it to the authorities now handling the criminal portion of the case. It was petty, reckless, and ultimately futile. But it confirmed what Claire already knew. Some people don't stop until they are made to. The district attorney's office opened a formal inquiry into Catherine's involvement with Greenview Designs and their procurement of restricted materials. While Claire wasn't updated on every detail, Valerie kept her informed of major developments. Depositions were taken, financial records were subpoenaed. More residents began to speak up. Those who had been pressured, fined, manipulated into selling their homes under duress. The facade Catherine had built around herself began to crack, not in one dramatic explosion, but in small, methodical breaks. The community she had once ruled through decorum and fear now questioned everything she'd ever done. And in the center of it all stood Claire, not as a martyr or a hero, but as someone who simply refused to be erased. In the final days of spring, as the garden bloomed with new life, Claire began to rebuild. Not just the flower beds and the stone paths, but the space itself, the feeling of safety, the peace she had once taken for granted. She planted new rosemary, replanted lavender, and installed a trellis wrapped in clematis that she trained by hand each morning. Each act of gardening now felt like reclamation, not of land, but of self. And when she stood on her porch in the evening, looking out over the garden that nearly didn't survive, she no longer saw a war zone. She saw proof, living, blooming proof, that dignity doesn't need permission, and that some roots once planted deeply enough cannot be pulled. By the time summer settled fully over Silver Creek, the garden no longer bore the marks of what it had endured. The soil, once leached and deadened by chemicals, had been turned, enriched, and brought back to life through effort that most would never see or understand. The plants had returned stronger, not the same as before, but different in a way that felt earned, more layered, more wild, and unapologetically vibrant. Claire found herself spending longer hours outside, not out of vigilance, but choice. For the first time since arriving in this place, she could simply exist in her own space without bracing for some unseen consequence. The fear had not vanished, but it had been quieted. And in its place stood something firmer, resolve, and a kind of earned calm that came only after surviving something meant to uproot you. The committee, or what was left of it, underwent a full restructuring. With Catherine gone and several of her closest allies stepping down in quiet succession, a new slate of candidates came forward. Residents who had once remained silent, now emboldened by what Claire had exposed. Claire did not run for any position, nor did she attend every meeting, but she made her presence known. When asked, she gave honest accounts of her experience, not dramatized but clear, with timelines and facts. People listened, some out of guilt, others out of genuine curiosity, and slowly the culture of the neighborhood began to shift. It wasn't dramatic, not overnight, but real change never is. Decorative uniformity was no longer spoken of as a moral code. Rules were rewritten. Language was softened. The bylaws that had once weaponized conformity were revised with clearer limits and, more importantly, accountability. Occasionally, Claire still received sideways looks from the older crowd, those who saw her not as a neighbor but as the woman who disrupted what they called tradition. But even that faded with time. She was no longer a target. She had become a fixture, her presence too firmly rooted to ignore or dislodge. And her garden, messy, fragrant, inconsistent, stood not as a statement, but as a choice made visible. Not everyone understood it. Not everyone liked it. But no one touched it again. And that, in the end, was enough.